So our other question is from Galen, a frequent flyer on the hot seat. I don't see him in the audience. He's writing about kind of the bridge between scripture and more modern psychological approaches to processing. So it's about a paragraph. I'll just read it. Dear Sat Shree, I'm wondering if you could clarify on the connection between scriptural approaches to controlling or restraining the senses and the more psychological approach to seeing, understanding how the ego operates. For example, it seems like quite a different approach to not allow oneself to be taken for a ride by one's emotions through refusal, which is how I understand scriptural prescription, and not going on a ride through seeing the mechanics of projections. For example, knowing that my dislike of someone points to an unacknowledged part of myself. The first feels forceful and less effective, whereas the second is effortless, if it can be accomplished. Or again, I don't see scriptural references to shame structures or other such things. So this psychological approach seems quite important, and yet doesn't seem to be addressed scripturally, except obliquely. Is this addressing something different and new, perhaps due to the modern form of ego blockage, or is it something old that is simply being put into modern language?
All right, very good. Galen. The nature of the question is really the 3 R's. Okay, but I do believe you answered it. But I think I want to enrich in that inquiry. The 3 R's are rejection, restraint, and relinquishing. And why there are 3 qualities to this is some things are so embedded, they are so overwhelm you that your only option is to initially reject them. Now, the pattern of rejection in the scriptures is, of course, based on that very male tradition in which almost all spirituality rose up, which was to separate you from that which you're rejecting. So the pattern of that was aligned with the truth of bringing the sword of truth and cutting away the darkness, right? Cut out the cancer. It was an all or nothing. And that has a role to play, like in the case of addiction, in case of negative, repetitive stories, especially ones that we apply to ourselves about self-diminishment. The pattern of rejecting is bringing forward the authority in you that can kill the alternative. So rejection has a power that should not be diminished. The only problem with it, it is only a temporary solution, because the ultimate path of the scriptures is to rejection of everything that you are as a person, rejection of your very existence as a human being. That's not our purpose. And it's never been the purpose of the creation. It was an interim structure in the evolution of man to going to truth. The only way out was to get rid of the untruth. Restraining. Now, restraining we do all the time. That's kind of like a human way where you got a tendency, but you restrain it. Now, I mein, it's just like Anandamayi was sharing. She has a tendency maybe to speak up, but she restrains it and therefore protects her from any risk of being judged by others. So the restraining is not unfamiliar with us. You know, if you've eaten, you just had a piece of cake, you restrain the inclination to get another one, right? We have so many places where restraining is actually an appropriate behavior as we maneuver ourselves through our own desires and preferences and structures for something other than what's immediately arising, right? So you reject the extra piece of cake because you don't want to get fat, right? Or you reject the extra piece of cake because you get sick when you overeat sweets. So these are natural unfoldings. That has a role to play on the spiritual path at all as well. Restraining the inclination means there's a tendency to a behavior that you know the outcome is keeping the diminishment or the negativity in place. We restrain by not feeding. So the restraining pulls back our consent to be overtaken by a pattern within ourselves that is determining behavior in the outer world which feeds our diminishment or feeds an error of our ego to control or to dominate or to be right or to judge and criticize or find fault. That restraining, not going down the rabbit hole, starts withdrawing our attention from lifelong patterns of adapting to life based on our ego. So restraint is another means of rejection, ultimately. It's more fluid. It has us more there. There's more inclusion of that which we're restraining rather than rejection, where we kill the opposite. But I remember the power of rejection with my daughter. When she was young going to school, she had all these fears that would come up when she was like 4, 5, 6, 7, first grades of school. And so she saw a family, a school counselor, and she told her to take all these feelings and put them in a box and close the lid. So basically reject them. Put them in a box, close the lid. And I said, that's not going to work. You know, that's kind of like magical thinking. My God, it changed her whole life. She suddenly was able to come and interact with other kids to not have this thing overtake her. She just needed to remember all the negatives. She stuck in a box and closed it up. So that was an interim solution in rejection. But ultimately, she had to open the box back up and come to terms with what was in that box. But interimly, it was a right action. So coming to terms is this restraining the inclinations that we know bring us suffering, limitation, negativity. And the last form of these 3 R's is relinquishing. Now, relinquishing has more authority than these other 2. It is relinquishing a tendency in you that has served you up to now, but no longer serving you. So you relinquish, that means you let go and get off the position that you have that you're relinquishing. So relinquishing has more inclusion in it, but it's a letting go. It's okay, I have this tendency in me or in my reaction to the world, and it seems to have a truth to it, and yet I'm recognizing that it's not serving ultimately. Then I can relinquish the vestment in the position or the point of view or the attachment or the clinging structures that are still shaping me. I let them go. I release them. That's probably the restraining and the relinquishing is the psychological path into what you're speaking, Galen. The rejection, though, has a role to play. I had to reject my addiction. I had to spend 7 years every time it came up rejecting it. It was a continuous process. And initially I was put into circumstances where the very thing that I was addicted to, I had opportunities to get very easily. And I had to consciously reject the inclination to take advantage of the situation. So the rejection became an initial power. Now, when I was able to reject my addiction, then I found something else. I discovered my rage. I discovered the angry part of me that the addiction was covering up. And that was the next territory. And a lot of that had to do with meeting it because I didn't have the authority to reject it. It was too powerful. All I could do was try to restrain it. And in the restraint, yes, it was false. The raging was going on inwardly, but outwardly, I was not speaking it or acting on it. But in time, it took years, I gained enough authority to relinquish the part of me that used rage to come into existence. So there are stages of this process. And of course, each has a role to play, depending upon how fully we're in touch with that we've been rejecting, we've been restraining, and we've been relinquishing. This is how we integrate. This is how we reorganize our personality and our embodiment and the habit of our embodiment to be an expression of the greater truth that's coming to us spiritually. So they are all needed and useful. You cannot solve your problems by indulging them. You can't change your behavior by indulging them. You can't keep following only your preferences and rejecting those parts that you don't wish to be with. These will not allow for the full integration of this journey. Okay.